You're listening to episode 57 of the Master Your Mind, Business, and Life podcast. This week's episode has us discussing two very different topics, fashion and marriage. And if you're thinking, how the heck do these two come together? Well, don't you worry your pretty little self, because we make it happen. Today's guest has been an on-air host for brands such as Vogue, Better Homes and Gardens, and Good Morning America. She has a personal style blog and has a top-rated podcast that she runs with her husband called Marriage is Funny. I am excited to introduce to you Jessie Artigue, but first, the review of the week. This week's review was submitted through the website from Ann Best, and it reads, I bought Lauren's book off Amazon, which is how I found the podcast, and I'm so glad I found it. I know this is a weekly show, but I would love more episodes. Wednesdays can't come fast enough. And you have not been the first to request more episodes, but it's got me wondering of how many of the fans feel this way. If you would like an extra dose of Master Your Mind, Business, and Life, shoot me a message and let me know. I'll also open up a poll on Instagram for voting, so be sure you're following me on @MindBizLife. And of course, to have your review featured, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your preferred podcast app. Okay, are you ready to meet Jessie? You know what to do. Tune in, turn it up, let's go.
You're listening to Master Your Mind, Business, and Life. Conversations with everyday world shifters, truth seekers, and rule breakers. Here's your host, Lauren Smith.
Hey everyone, it's Lauren Smith. Welcome back to another episode. Today, I am joined by on-air host, mentor, and creative entrepreneur, Jessie Artigue. Jessie, welcome to the show. I am so excited to have you join me today.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm excited to be here too.
You know, you are straight up goals girl. Besides your podcast with your husband, which I have recently become hooked to, you guys are just so dang funny. You've been an on-air host for brands such as Vogue, Kashi Cereal, Better Homes and Gardens, Good Morning America. I mean, the list goes on. So color me intrigued, but I would love to hear a little bit more about your journey and what led you to this place in life.
Oh my gosh, where do I begin? Well, let's see. I have been an entrepreneur for now going on, gosh, is it 10 or 11? 11 years next month, actually.
Woo!
So celebrate a little milestone. But honestly, the biggest thing I would say that's brought me to where I am today is just being a constant learner and being constantly excited about uncovering just sort of the best way to go about designing a happy, healthy, and flavorful life. And it's looked so many different ways for me in terms of career, but it also has spilled over into my personal life, my relationships, my physical health, all kinds of things. And so my current projects are very much, I would say, intentionally created around the sort of life that I try to live, and are also sort of like a culmination of so many of the other different professional experience I've had throughout my life. And that's kind of where the story gets messy. I don't know which direction you want me to take it, because I've done so many different things. But.
Yeah, you have. Well, let's start with talking about style, because you're an expert on style. So what really got you into that? Like, did you major in that in college?
That's a good question.
Fashion?
No, I didn't actually. I studied broadcast journalism with an emphasis in new media, basically. And when I graduated, I thought that I was going to go into TV news, and that's what all my internships were in. I basically had a couple of job offers in that industry, but had already promised my husband I would move with him to the middle of the country for his grad school program. And so we picked up and moved basically a few months after I graduated. We got married, picked up and moved from San Diego to Kansas City. And it was right as the recession was kind of in full force, and the economy was crashing. A lot of jobs were being eliminated, and it was harder for me to find a TV gig out there in a smaller market than I was expecting. And so I took a job at a local architecture firm that I loved. It was doing marketing and PR, and really was not feeling creatively fulfilled. So, as many at this point, hundreds of thousands, it feels like people have done since then and before then, I started a blog as a way to sort of have a creative outlet. And again, this was like, gosh, this is now 11 years ago, 11 or 12 years ago that I started my blog, and it was all focused on style. That's been a major love and hobby of mine. And so I was documenting my own outfits before that was even really a thing, and documenting street style. We lived in Kansas City, Missouri at the time, and I was sort of surprised and delighted to find that there was tons and tons and tons of creative expression happening in the style scene there, even though I'd come from, a coastal city and wasn't sure what to expect in terms of style. They are doing it right in Kansas City.
Really?
Oh my gosh. And there's tons of places we've lived even since then where I'm like, you might not think of this. I honestly think you could find style no matter where you go, depending on what your definition of it is. But anyway, so I started this blog and then started doing local TV segments, being able to combine my background in television and on-air hosting with this sort of hobby of giving and sharing and talking about style advice was really a perfect fit. But I was still working my full-time job. And then I think my blog grew pretty quickly from there. I mean, Instagram wasn't around yet. Twitter was barely a thing. And I had a lot of local acquaintances and then random kind of branching off friends of friends say, hey, can you come help me with my closet? I'd love style advice. I'd love some help packing for this or dressing up for this or whatever. And so I started a styling business, and that was actually my very first business. That's the one that I was referencing. Now that I'm thinking of the timeline, I guess it'll be 10 years. No, I think it'll be 10 years in September that I launched out on my own.
Entrepreneur life is so hard to keep track of.
I know. It's a blur. It is a blur. And I've had so many different projects in places since then that I can't keep it all straight. Anyway, so that was how I started into the style industry. And then since then, really have had a full and flourishing 10 years in the fashion industry and have loved every minute.
Oh man. I always admire people who just look on point because, I think that personal style is something that I feel like I failed with for the first, 28 years of my life. Yeah.
Tell me.
I just never felt comfortable in my clothes. I guess I also didn't know how to dress for my body. I would be able to see someone else wear it and I'm like, oh, I can duplicate that. And then you put it on, you're like, yeah, no, that's doesn't look right. I look like a potato sack, So it's only become very recent, I would say within the past 3 years or so. But I felt like I've been able to step into my personal style. And I know I can't be the only one who has struggled with this.
Oh my gosh. Well, I even still struggle sometimes. So
really?
You're definitely not, of course. You're definitely not the only one. Not at all.
Where can we start when it comes to developing and I guess ultimately owning our personal style?
One good place to start, I generally tend to, I don't actually work with personal styling clients anymore. From there, I went into more commercial and editorial styling and working with large brands and publications and even ad agencies for TV commercials and print commercials and stuff. But one of the things that I've seen across the entire board, whether I'm sitting on the floor of a closet with a personal styling client or in some high-rise, office building talking about a huge multi-million-dollar campaign, is that the most important thing is whoever you're talking about dressing has to be able to feel most like themselves when they're dressed in said outfit in order for my efforts or my job to be successful. So whether it's a stay-at-home mom or a retired teacher in my neighborhood or a model that's being paid a ton of money to dress like either one of those things.
Yeah.
You really want the person to feel most like themselves, but just the polished and most appropriate, expression of themselves. And so I think in terms of general advice, I always say to start by asking questions about the internal self, truly, before necessarily looking at general trends or current, things that are in season. Obviously that can all play into it. Absolutely. But you mentioned a second ago, part of it is knowing your body, your external self. But I think another part of it is really finding how that overlaps well with what you want to express in terms of, your internal world as well.
So a lot of self-awareness there.
I think self-awareness and just knowing, even if it's as simple as saying, what do I want my mood to be today? And so, for instance, I have a business meeting later today, and I'm like not half dressed because I am fully clothed right now, but I'm like half dressed for that meeting. But it's funny because on a normal day, I put on this morning like a normal day outfit, knowing that I'd be talking to you, but that, you didn't mind if I'd be sitting here in my workout clothes or whatever. Right. And so I put on cut off shorts and like a 3/4 length loose, kind of like boxy sweatshirt.
Yeah.
And then like 15 minutes before we started talking, I thought, oh my gosh, I have to run to a business meeting right after this. How do I want to feel? I'm standing in my closet and I'm literally saying, how do I want to feel for that meeting? Well, it's a new client. We've never met before. So all of these things, like I'm kind of info gathering as I think through this thought process of like, how do I want to portray myself? How do I want him to understand who I am creatively? Because it is a creative session that we're having. Yeah. And just all of these things. And so then I choose based on how I want to feel, but also how I want to be seen. And I think just even starting to ask yourself those questions can be a helpful way to uncover maybe what direction to take your actual wardrobe, or even just on a micro level, your outfit of whatever day you're talking about.
Yeah. What if like we're just like not feeling anything? You ever have one of those days like where it's just, like, this is a no. This is a no.
So here's an interesting thing. I have been living out of a suitcase with the same pieces, the same, like essentially, I don't technically do capsule wardrobes, but if you're packing, that's kind of essentially, since April.
Wow.
I don't know when this is going to go live, but you and I are chatting and it's August.
Yeah.
So it's been a bit. So very often lately I go to my closet and I'm like, I'm so sick of this stuff. And really, I think it's kind of a combination. My approach to when I'm not feeling it is to either get creative. Like I try to use it as a creative restriction and thinking, okay, again, looking at your day, what do you have to do today? If it's hanging out with the kiddos because it's summer and that's what a typical day looks like, then maybe it's comfort. Okay, I want to feel comfortable, or I want to feel somewhat polished while still casual and approachable and cute. You know what I mean? And figuring out, and then maybe it's opting for a tried and true favorite that you know you're going to feel comfortable in, and then adding like a fabulous pair of earrings just to zhuzh it up a little bit.
Yeah.
I use accessories a lot when I'm not feeling something in general to just kind of like punch up an outfit that maybe otherwise doesn't feel as exciting as I want it to.
Like a plain t-shirt or like a fun necklace or something. Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I like how you said when you were talking about living out your suitcase, I started thinking about, we had a podcast guest who, they live in a tiny home.
Oh yeah.
And they told us that, Tim had told us that he only has 8 outfits. And I was just like, my man. And I was like, I was like, but you also live in Florida and there's no like seasonal clothes, it's like,
yeah, exactly.
It does help a little bit, but I'm just like, whoa, I couldn't imagine. I'm when we were talking about like, you're really just being aware of what you feel, being, aware of what you want to express. And I think that all just really links back to your mindset, and mastering your mind is really possible. It does take work. And then we get into these life situations that can turn something really positive into a negative. Do you have any tips or tricks that you use to reorient your mindset when, life throws some unexpected curveballs your way?
Oh, what a good question. I have quite a few. It's funny. I asked my therapist recently, I was like, are these coping mechanisms? And she said, yes. And I was like, oh gosh, I didn't realize I was like, just coping. And she goes, no, coping mechanisms can be great.
Depending on what they are, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, totally. She was like, they can be wonderful if they help you cope with something that's otherwise unpleasant, or, and as long as it's healthy. But I have a lot of things in my toolbox. I'm extremely, I would say, spiritual and in tune with my faith. And so prayer is a huge part of that for me, but I also am a verbal processor. And so many times it's like hopping on Marco Polo. Have you heard of the Marco Polo app?
No.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, pause the like meaningful spiritual conversation.
Yeah, tell me about it. Like my eyes just like lit up.
Okay.
Like, new app. Ooh.
Well, because we've moved around so much, most of my best friends are spread out around the country. And so this is literally my favorite app for keeping in touch. And my family lives out of state from where I live too. So it's honestly, it's a life changer. But so it's basically like a walkie-talkie app. It's similar to Voxer, but it's video. It's almost like combining Snapchat or Instagram stories with Voxer because you're just leaving like video voicemails for each other. You can have a group chat or just personal chat. And it's amazing because you can do it like I feel like it's one of those things where you can do it while you're doing other stuff.
Yeah.
But so to answer your question, and this is why I brought it up, is a lot of times it's like poloing my best friend who really only lives like 30 minutes away. But if I need to talk something through and I'm having a rubbish morning, I will hop on there and just say, hey, I need to vent and process. And I know she'll listen to it eventually. She's not watching it live necessarily. You can watch it live, but I don't even need her to be watching it live. I just need to talk it out,
Yeah.
And I obviously every once in a while call my mom, talk to my husband. I'm a talker. And so being able to process verbally is huge. And then I'm super, super into fitness. And so going for a long run is helpful. In terms of mindset, I think I'm very intentional about my thoughts because of how much they shape our beliefs. And so sometimes it's helps me realize, like, if I'm in a mood where I'm like, ugh, yikes, what's going on here? It's one of those things where it's like a red flag that I need to sit down and really either write out or think through what's going on in my brain that I need to get a hold of. It's almost like a little kid.
Me.
Yeah. What triggered me. And it's just being compassionate with my mind, but also, what's the word? Giving it guidelines and boundaries so that it doesn't think it can just run all over the place and splatter paint on the walls and make a mess of things.
Yeah. And sometimes I find just writing things down, it helps your mind, because your mind can just go so deep. And it's like you have to release it sometimes just by
I'm also a big fan of pen to paper writing things out because I think my mind works so quickly, and I don't say that as, it's not a point of pride for me. It's actually more of the time, it's like a pinball machine is how I describe it. It's like a bunch of little metal balls pinging around the inside of a noisemaker.
I feel it.
Right? So honestly, one of the things that's helpful to me about a pen and paper over like typing, for instance, or dictating, I have a few friends that do a lot of like dictation into their voice memo app on their phone. But when I write pen to paper, I feel like it forces my brain. It's almost like breath work. It forces my brain to slow down because I can only write so fast. Even if I'm writing really fast, I can still only write so fast.
Right.
And so it's like you're just focusing on exactly what you're writing and your brain sort of stays there until you finish the thought. And then you know what I mean? It's a good way to slow things down in my experience.
So continuing on with emotional health, because we know that, mindset ultimately attributes to your emotional health. What are some ways that you nurture your emotional health to make sure that you're not draining yourself, because you have a really busy life and a lot of things going on. So it can be really easy to just be depleted.
Big fan of therapy.
Yeah.
I do a handful of different types of therapy. Actually, I see like a counselor regularly for just general kind of talk therapy. When she has a strong emphasis on emotional health, and various different emotional techniques. I also, see someone for craniosacral therapy. I've done a couple of different types of neurofeedback. But I'm a big reader too. And so I think a lot of emotional health for me has come from just understanding personal development, that whole world more thoroughly in order to understand myself more thoroughly. And so, there's so many books that I've been able to learn from that help me, I think, get a better picture of who I am. And that helps me show up as a more whole person in the world for sure.
Yeah. Do you feel that by having a lot of people in your support system, like you're not always leaning on your husband or, in your relationship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that actually has been, how do I say this nicely? That's been a challenge for us in marriage. Yeah. I mean, we've been married for 12 years, and I would say it's had its ups and downs in terms of how much we do or don't rely on each other for, it's almost like the amount of things we rely on each other for is constantly in flux, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so
as the relationship changes and goes through different growth periods, you need different things from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so in the times in which we've relied on each other for everything, that's sometimes when things tend to fall apart. And I don't know that it's necessarily because of that, but I think you have like a larger liability when it's almost like, seems like a really weird word picture to use, but it's like putting your eggs in one basket. And obviously I'm not like, I'm not like looking elsewhere for a partner in terms of, my marriage. But at the same time, for instance, in terms of intimacy, Gerard and my husband and I talk about emotional intimacy, physical intimacy, intellectual intimacy, spiritual intimacy. There's so many different ways that you can be intimate with someone.
Right.
And obviously there should be some level of intimacy, I think, in all categories with your partner. But then there's times in which your partner can't give you, like, a good example I would say right now for us is on the intellectual intimacy thing. Like, my husband is in a really, really, really busy, ridiculous season at work right now. I think last week he billed like 90 hours. So
wow.
I don't get a lot of like meaningful, deep adult conversations with him in those seasons because, and I don't say that like, I don't get it, but I say it because I kind of let him be, because I know that his brain is working more than normal.
Right.
And I'm okay with it because I know it's a season and his work is pretty cyclical. But so in those times, I'm able to rely on friends or my business mastermind ladies or my dad or my brother, people that I am also close to in life, where it's
just leaning on your tribe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. What made you and your husband start the podcast? What led to that?
We were experiencing a pretty tricky season of our marriage. And that's probably putting it nicely. I think we'd been married for about maybe almost 8 years. And we were really going through a rough patch. We were living in New York City, and we'd moved from Kansas City to the East Coast. And we were really enjoying ourselves in terms of having fun and also both feeling like our careers were flourishing. I mean, it was a huge move for both of our work, and a positive one. But then at the same time, socially, things changed significantly for us. We both had a lot of friends there, but they were separate. Like, I had really, really special work colleagues and friends that I'd made through, gigs and such and blogging and all of that. And he had a really tight knit work community too. And so we didn't have a lot of other couples that we were hanging out with. And we now have learned that is vital to his and my relationship. I don't know that it's like that for everybody, but I firmly believe that every healthy couple needs other healthy couples around them. And
it can be so hard for that.
I know. And if it's not geographically possible, like in that moment, it was really challenging for us to find other couples that shared our same life values. Like, we would try to make a date, like a double date with another couple, and they'd be like, great. The next time we can get together is 9:30 PM 6 weeks from now on like a Wednesday night. And we're like, what?
Yeah.
I think in the circles that we were running in, everybody was prioritizing either growing a family. And so that was sort of taking over, or it was a lot of young couples who were just gunning it in their professional lives. And so they were working these crazy long hours, and he and I weren't working as crazy hours as he does now. I guess I was probably to be honest, I was working way harder because I was, running my own business and didn't have help at the time and just was kind of trying to figure out all the different ways to manage that. But anyways, all that to say, we realized at one point we were having so many fights, and so many, and when I say fights, we were disagreeing on so much, and we would come to a stalemate and feel like there's no way we can make progress right now.
Right. Now what?
So yeah, now what? And so jokingly one day he goes, why don't we just, I said, why don't we just record this conversation and send it to Liz and Ben or Rick and Joanna or Tim and Shauna or whoever, the people who we used to sit around the dinner table with, and say, hey, you guys were really struggling with this. They were still now, or not still, they had by then been all spread out around the country. And he goes, that sounds like an idea for a podcast. And he was joking, because then I was like, I love it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, what have I done? Because he was not on board. It took me about a year to convince him.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. I never would have guessed that.
He loves it now, but he's a more private person. He was more private before we started.
Well, and I guess now that you guys are seasoned veterans with it too, it's a little bit easier now, I'm sure, to know when to pull back and when to just go full in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Relationships in general are just full of expectations. We place these expectations on ourselves to be the best spouse, the best partner, but we also have those expectations upon our partners to be all they can be as well. How can we manage healthy expectations, not only for ourselves, but for our partners and beyond?
Girl, this is so hard. I'm figuring this out still daily, at least weekly, maybe daily.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, one of the very first conversations that we had that ended up on the podcast is about this very thing, because Gerard was, I don't even remember what we were talking about specifically, but he was getting really frustrated with the fact that he didn't feel like he was performing to his best as a husband. And he blurts out at one point in the episode, I really do think it might be episode 1, but I can't remember. He goes, I just want to be the perfect husband for you. And I said, no offense. First of all, that's very sweet, but no offense. I have never been under the impression that you were going to be the perfect husband. I would never have expected that of you. I understand expecting it of yourself, because I struggle with that as well. But I wanted to give him permission and liberate him from that idea that he has to be the perfect guy in order for our marriage to work. And so we now, ever since then, have coined the term perfect love is really only reserved, in our opinion, for what we experience with our Creator. And that within a marriage or within a relationship, if you aim for great love, it's such a more gracious and achievable way of looking at it. And so we say great love over perfect love, because once you give up aiming for perfect, it's almost like the ease with which the rest of it falls into place. I mean, obviously I'm not saying marriage is easy once you figure that one thing out.
Right. Yeah.
It makes a huge difference, because then you're not striving so hard and also mad at yourself or mad at the other person for not achieving something specific. And we do talk a lot about expectations on the show, because that is also something that we both struggle with and are constantly figuring out. But I think once we started talking through those things specifically was when there was a huge shift for us toward health, for sure.
Has your communication improved because of the podcast?
Oh yeah. I mean, if anything, it's interesting. So when we first started, I think one of the other things, aside from knowing that we'd have the mediation or feedback from friends at some level, or even like a bunch of strangers, which was just as good for us, there was also this element of accountability, because we were basically like committing to putting up an episode. And so having conversations beyond just like the administrative things that you talk about in wife when it comes to like running a household or whatever.
Right.
I think that's been really good for our communication, but I think it also has enabled us to, well, it's interesting for me. So I produce and edit the show. And so for instance, if we have a particularly rocky conversation, which happens often, I'm the one that has to listen back to it. And boy, oh boy, does that give me a lot of insight.
I'm sure.
My own habits. Yeah. Like I'll be like, wow, a lot of things I notice have to do with triggers. Like he'll say something and I'll fly off the handle and be like, and then as I'm listening back, I'll think to myself, wow, I got really upset because this thing that he said triggered me in a way that I've never realized that actually triggers me, which then it enables me to then go to him and say, honey, I know this is maybe going to sound funny, but when you say, what a million times in a conversation, it makes me feel like you're not listening. And when I don't feel like you're listening, then I don't think I'm being heard. And that feels like a slight to my personality or, you know, makes me feel like you're bored or you know what I mean? All these things. And so I can explain it to him instead of just being angry or pouting or whatever I used to do before. It's a little bit better about just, I think again, it goes back to being self-aware. And this project of ours has really contributed to both of our self-awareness for sure.
Yeah. What have you learned about yourself as a wife through the podcast journey?
Where do I begin? Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, the biggest thing is just that there's no such thing as a perfect wife. And I actually did a spin-off miniseries show called The Perfect Wife, which was a joke because she doesn't exist. And it's definitely not me, even if she did exist. I think it's the biggest thing. And then also I think, you know, the more we do this show, and for anyone listening who's curious, it's not marriage advice by any means. We're like, he and I are not experts. We both do have some experience in the personal growth / pastoral space. And so I think those personality traits of ours lend themselves well to enjoying the aspect of mentoring young couples. And so maybe that comes through, but we don't talk about like the 3 best ways to or this. You know, we don't do that at all. We literally are just talking through our own stuff through the lens of being a married couple. And so I think one of the biggest things that I've learned about being a wife is that I don't have to necessarily be like a marriage and family therapist or a marriage expert, if there is such a thing. In order to consume or continue to learn. It's almost like, think of how many jobs out there have some form of continuing education attached to them. Like my mom's a dental hygienist and she goes to continuing education classes all the time because you have to like keep your knowledge current, right?
Right.
And yet our in most cases, our marriage or our life partnership is our primary relationship. And most people don't do any sort of continuing education as it relates to that. But how much better off would we be if that were the norm? And so I think I've learned that continuing to pursue being a great wife does not necessarily need to be attached to any sort of career or profession, but should be just a part of me wanting to love him to the best of my abilities.
Oh, I love that. Oh, I love that a lot. I love also that your podcast, for anyone, if you haven't already added it to your queue while you're listening to this, I love that the episodes are rule. Like,
oh yes. Oh my gosh. Those are fun to come up with.
Yeah, I'm sure. Because the first one I listened to, I was like, because I was just like reading the headlines first and I was cracking up when I got to it. And it's the first one I listened to was the always prune your bushes before a big party. I was like, I gotta listen. This is where I'm starting. Like I gotta.
And a lot of them are word plays. So I can imagine how you, but we are actually talking about real bush pruning in your yard, but it's fun because we both have a background in stand-up comedy, and so we love incorporating humor into really most of what we do, but especially with the show. And so those rules, some of them are like true to an extent, but then a lot of them are jokes, obviously. Right. I mean, some of them are funnier than others, but I think one of the reasons why we chose to do that, and I love that you caught on, is because I think there's a lot of really, I almost said a bad word, crappy marriage advice out there.
There is. Yeah.
And a lot of it is based on like these rules. Like one of them is that always comes to mind for me that we threw out the window probably like on our wedding night, was don't go to bed angry.
Oh,
I don't think we went to bed angry on our wedding night, but it was one of those things where it's like, you can go to bed feeling whatever emotion you want to, and you don't owe it to the other person to have a specific like emotional status before you fall asleep. But then number two, like there are plenty of conversations that don't end in a tidy manner, where it's way better to sleep before you continue the conversation than to just stay up until, don't pull an all-nighter fighting if you have the option to fall asleep and then continue the conversation rested the next day. So anyways, we kind of have, we actually have a course we're working on right now too, that's called the 10 Marriage Myths That Nearly Ruined Our Relationship. Oh. And it's based on a keynote talk that we've given at a couple of big universities. And it goes so well that people come up to us afterwards and always offer more myths. Like we wrote our 10 myths that have like really messed with us.
Right.
How we flip them on their head in order to heal from them. But we'll have people come up to us like in the entryway and say like, oh my gosh, let me tell you about the myth that nearly ruined us, or it's so interesting to me because you really can sort of get conflicting advice from people, and you can get kind of caught up in this like, oh my gosh, I have to check all these boxes and do all these things right in order to be this unit or this couple that looks a certain way from the outside. And I think everybody's relationship is just going to look so different. I mean, if you think about how every human is so different on every level, and then you think about how a marriage is combining two of those unique snowflakes into one brand new combination, it's like, oh my word, no one piece of advice is going to work for everybody. I mean, of course, there's some good, encouraging words that can help in a lot of cases. We like to say talking things out and tight bear hugs fix almost anything. And that's one that I feel like probably goes for pretty much everybody. But again, that's more of an encouragement or a suggestion than a hard and fast piece of advice,
Yeah, I love that. And I'm definitely one of those people where like I have to put myself to bed sometimes. Like that it really resets me. So I could just be, and I could not even be fighting. I could just be in a really foul mood. And it's just like, I'm putting myself to bed. Like I had to do that on Friday. I was like, good night, guys. I love you all. I'm putting myself to bed.
But honestly, the fact that that is a gift to your family. Like, there's plenty of people who would just push through and then
you're a nightmare.
I was going to say, I wasn't going to say you were a nightmare, but
I would have been a nightmare.
That's what I was thinking about myself is like, it's better off for everybody involved if I just go to bed sometimes.
Yes. And I was also thinking when you're talking about the marriage myths, I could imagine that so many of them play into the way that you were raised and the type of marriage or relationship that you saw your parents have. And it's just, again, that also goes back to those expectations of
big time,
whatever roles that they played in your life or.
Yeah. And we are really interested in frames of reference. That's those conversations have come into play a lot for Gerard and I in terms of understanding who we are and why we turned out this way. Yeah. And then another thing I was going to mention on that note is if anyone's looking for a great book that really goes in depth into really so much about your story from birth till now, and how specifically your childhood your childhood development in terms of psychology has such a huge impact on not only who you choose, but how it goes and whether or not the relationship ends up working out. And so it really, I would say like so the book is called Getting the Love You Want.
Oh.
And it's by Harville Hendricks. But I would say the first maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of, maybe 2/3, probably the first 2/3 of the book, you're learning about yourself and your own personal development, or not even just like current personal development, but like childhood development. And I had a lot of journaling to do throughout that book. And I had a wonderful, wonderful childhood. But there's so many things. I have very, very precious parents. They're happily married 41 years. And Gerard comes from a very similar story, but we both, you're going to pick stuff up along the way, no matter what.
Yeah.
And so I just cannot tell you how much progress we've made. He's reading the book now. And it's interesting because like I read it at the beginning of this year. And now that he's reading it, I'm kind of remembering as we're talking through a handful of the things, I'm remembering back so much of what I learned, a handful of months ago. And just seeing it through his lens now has been so interesting, but that's a really good one if you're thinking through frames of reference.
Yeah, I'll be sure to link that in the episode notes as well. I'm going to add that to my little library checkout next time I go. Well, Jessie, if you could give one piece of relationship advice to our listeners, what would that be?
Gosh, I think we already touched on it a second ago, but I would just say choosing great love over perfect love is probably the core of any sort of advice I'd give, because marriage is so beautiful and it can be so fun and wonderful, but it can also be hard and messy and a lot of other things that are less pleasant than we would maybe like. But I think giving yourself grace, giving your partner grace, understanding that you're both people that are continuing to grow and expand throughout the journey is important. And it can be so challenging because obviously since you're both separate people, you both can make decisions, and occasionally people's decisions hurt the other person. And it's so complex. We can't distill it down into just one paragraph even. But right. I think just this understanding that humans are resilient. And so even if there's deep hurt or pain or regret or any of those things, there's still such a wonderful, beautiful opportunity to allow the relationship to grow new roots. And we talk about having deep roots and reaping sweet fruit. So
I love that.
I would say that's another component of that as well.
I love that. I know our listeners are going to want to get more of you in their life. So what is the best way for them to connect with you further?
Gosh, well, I love hanging out on Instagram. My handle is Style and Pepper, and my website's jessieartigue.com, but also come check out the podcast if you're curious about great love and what that looks like in the context of a marriage that is made up of two people trying to figure it out as we go.
Yes, definitely.
We're doing a really exciting real live event in February. It's going to be a big summit, a weekend summit here in Long Beach. And so we have really, really, really incredible speakers coming, and we're going to have late night comedy and dance parties and Mexican food and
dang.
And it's going to be awesome. So
you just described my perfect weekend.
Oh my God. You guys should come. It's going to be for any young couples who want to enrich their marriage and understand what it looks like to grow a marriage that's rooted in great love. That's what we're all about. So
I love that.
At meetthepeppers.com too.
Perfect. Jessie, I have loved getting to know you. You've dropped so many great wisdom nuggets today. Thank you for sharing your light and bringing some style and fun to the podcast.
Anytime. You're great, Lauren. Thanks for having me.
You can find direct links to Jessie's podcast, social channels, and websites on this week's episode notes found on mindbizlife.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, I encourage you to subscribe to the podcast or be sure to share it on your social media channels. This helps get the podcast into the cars, homes, and earbuds of many. I'll see you back here next week for another episode, but until then, remember, every level of life is an opportunity to grow. Be well, my friend.